Before we get started, I just wanted to let you guys know of a couple of gifts we have available on our website. It's the Christmas season. Let's give some stuff away. We have a 14-day devotional based on The Princess Bride. It's called You Can Be a Hero and This Is How. And you can find it at menatthemovies.com/ebooks. And I'm offering an advanced portion. It's the intro and first chapter from my upcoming book called Unlock Your Story, How the Movies You Love Reveal the Key to Your Future. If you enjoy this podcast, you're going to love this book. So go to unlockyourstory.org to download this advanced content. Merry Christmas. This week on the Men at the Movies podcast, we celebrate Christmas with George Bailey and It's a Wonderful Life. If you want to help a man, you'll want to know something about him. George is invited into his father's purpose, but is offered permission to choose his own path. Thankfully, he had Mary as a partner to see his potential and live the adventure with him. Grab your eggnog and let's discover God's truth in this movie.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being. Merry Christmas and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast. My name is Paul McDonald and joining me via the Zoom is my buddy Britt. Hey man, Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas to you. How are you doing, man?
Doing great. Super excited to talk about It's a Wonderful Life.
Right.
As I've gotten older, this is one of my favorite Christmas tradition movies to watch, preferably by myself because I will cry.
Yeah. I think that goes for a lot of people because as you get older, you can relate more to George, because the story picks up on a life that seems to have been derailed in so many cases. And I think a lot of us feel that, stuck. Like we don't have anywhere to go.
Yeah, we're going to talk about all about George's dysfunctions and his reality and his wealth. And we'll talk about all that stuff in a minute. But first, this is airing on Christmas Eve. So I wanted to know, Britt, what are some of your family Christmas traditions?
We don't have a ton. One of them is Advent. My wife really brought that into our family. I didn't do Advent at all when I was a kid. We were definitely the more evangelical,
less liturgical.
I've learned to appreciate the liturgical a lot more growing up, just because I think there's more value to it than I realized when I was young. And so my wife wasn't really liturgical either growing up, but she really did like Advent. And she has a German background. So we have some Advent traditions that we do. And when they were younger, we would read scripture and then they would get their chocolate. That's not manipulative at all.
No, it's positive reinforcement.
We got a couple birthdays in December, so we don't do a lot, but we definitely watch a lot of movies, and that's my fault. So I bring the movies in. We watch Charlie Brown. Peanuts. We do Peanuts Christmas. That's a definite. We probably do a Lord of the Rings marathon at some point during the holidays, because we got some time to kind of hang out. And we'll be traveling this Christmas. We usually do Christmas Eve at my parents and then Christmas Day at my wife's parents. But my in-laws, they moved to Dallas. So we're going to have to go travel. So it'll be a little bit different this year. Yeah. We're going to have to start some new traditions, but that's life. That's kind of what we're talking about today, right? It's things change and it doesn't always go according to expectations. And you just got to roll with it. Like that's one of my favorite things about the character Mary in this movie is she just rolls with it, and she's creative along the way. And I have a wife like that who has been amazing. So anyway, so those are kind of the basics of what we do. How about you?
Growing up, we would open one present on Christmas Eve. Typically it was something from the grandparents. And then Christmas morning, we would always take breakfast to my parents in bed, and we would open our stockings up there and then the presents after. And my dad would always read the Christmas story because he's like, oh, we got to remember the reason. It's not Santa Claus and presents and trees and lights. It's Jesus and the arrival. It's Emmanuel and all that stuff. As I've had kids, it's been a little bit different, especially being divorced. Typically the kids have spent Christmas Eve with their mom, and then I get them about, around noon on Christmas Day. And then as they start driving, I talked to my dad earlier this week, and I said, it's much more, hey guys, here's our plans. We hope you join us occasionally.
Yeah, right. Because they start to have their own stuff.
Right. Yeah. But my youngest, Andrew, he's 15, and he hates putting up Christmas decorations. He says it should be done after Thanksgiving, which used to be my mindset. But then again, thinking that I want to celebrate the season as early as I can, but he does not object to buying eggnog as soon as it hits the shelves. So as soon as the eggnog is in the stores, we're starting picking that up for him. Because while he may not want the tree up in November, he definitely wants the eggnog in November. And who can blame him? And of course, watching Christmas Vacation and Die Hard.
Right.
Those are Christmas traditions. So
yeah.
This year I'm taking my wife out. They have these little string quartet things. It's lit by hundreds of candles, and you go and sit and you listen to them playing Christmas music for like an hour. And so we're going to do that. And it's like 9:00. So we'll have dinner, and then we'll go out and be all fancy or something. I don't know.
Sounds amazing.
I try to do something like that, whether it's going to see the Messiah or the Nutcracker or some sort of theatrical, classical sort of thing. So
that's cool.
Yeah. And of course, as we talked about, no Christmas season is complete without watching It's a Wonderful Life. So I don't even need to say, why did we pick this movie? Because it came out in 1946.
Wow.
So for the last 65 years, if my math is right. Is that right?
That's close. More like 75. 75.
I was told there'd be no math today.
Since it came out, it didn't really become a holiday staple right away. It was a flop when it came out, which is really amazing to me because the more I watch this movie, the more I'm impressed with how perfect it is. Like, it's one of those things where it's like, it just gets deeper. It just gets more perfect. Like every line of dialogue builds towards the themes and the messages and what's going on and the characters, and the characterization is amazing. So it's Frank Capra, who was, he was one of the best directors of his day. And of course you had Jimmy Stewart, who was one of the biggest stars of the day.
Yep.
And it was a flop when it came out. It was a flop. And it didn't really start to become a holiday staple until it was cheap to show because it was a flop. So what are you going to do on Christmas? You go show some movies, and this is a cheap one. And just over time, it's kind of like The Princess Bride. Over time, it became this classic that people just love. And when I was a kid, that we were going to watch it, and then they tried to colorize it when I was a kid. Like, that was cool. And I was like, just stop it. Just leave it alone. Yeah, that's
the version I watched on Amazon Prime. It was in color.
No. I can't do that.
Yeah. No school like the old school.
So it's become a staple, a little less now. I don't know if it's as popular with families now, but definitely when I was a kid, it was Rudolph, Frosty.
Yeah, I don't remember watching it too much when I was younger, but as I've gotten older, it's definitely resonated more and more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And it's funny because it's not even really closely related to Christmas.
Right. It just happens on Christmas.
The iconic scenes at the end.
Right.
You know, there's snow and then there's Merry Christmas, Bedford Falls.
Well, and the message of what is real wealth? What are we really after? And to be honest, it's what a lot of people know by now is there are a lot of suicides that happen around Christmas and the holidays, right? Because people feel it's a tough time for people who have been divorced or someone's died. I mean, and they're experiencing a holiday for the first time without a loved one, and there's, or they're sick or they're lonely, or there's just all sorts of things that are happening. And so, yeah, suicides and abuse. And I mean, it's really sort of tragic if you really look at the numbers, but a lot of that stuff goes up. And so we would think this is a happy season. People would pull it together, but it causes stress and it does sort of make you look at, man, what the heck am I doing with my life? And I can't buy presents and I can't do this and I can't, and all that sort of stuff. And so I think it's very timely, really. Like, even though you're right, like it only mentions Christmas there right at the end, but I think there are a lot of the themes are very closely connected to stuff that happens around Christmas. And this movie gets really dark. Like this movie gets super dark, which I love. Jimmy Stewart's his transition from young, happy-go-lucky, funny to like he is off his rocker at the end of the movie. Like, it's not just he's going to commit suicide. That
scene, that close up on his face as he leaves his mom's, and it sort of looks right to left, and he's got crazy eyes going on.
Oh, so good. And so it's got so much to it that's amazing. But again, I think it fits with Christmas a lot.
Yeah, and I think it's good for the season because it is a slower paced movie. You can sit back and in a lot of ways, it's like sitting down with an old friend. So if you haven't seen It's a Wonderful Life yet this Christmas season, go ahead, grab an eggnog or a beverage of choice, sit by the fire. If you have a gas fireplace, flip the switch, turn on the fire, watch this movie, and it is like sitting down with an old friend because we need to slow down. Because this should be a happy time. This should be a time of joy and family, and even the people who haven't suffered a great loss, like you mentioned, this could be your first holiday without a loved one, and that's super hard. But even if it's not, it's still super hard because of these expectations that we put on ourselves, especially when we look at the last 2 years. Yeah, coming out of this global pandemic, coming out of a contentious election. And it seems like there's always a contentious election going on. But this idea that we need to cut ourselves a little bit of slack, but there's a lot of pressure, especially for people who may not have seen family in the last 2 years. It's like, oh, this has to be perfect. And if the turkey's a little burned, or the tree doesn't look right, or you didn't get the 4 billion twinkling lights, to quote the National Lampoon, the lights aren't twinkling, Clark. Thanks for noticing, Dad. and because we do want to, we want to do the perfect Christmas. I think that's where we're going to start diving into the movie, because the perfect Christmas never looks like we thought it would. And George Bailey has this idea for what his life is going to be like. Even as a kid, he's like, I'm a National Geographic explorer. I've got this. And remember, he's on the date. I know what's going to happen today and tomorrow and every day after that. No, you don't, George.
All right.
One of the themes that I saw as, we're jumping right into this thing. Sort of, 15 minutes into our conversation. Let's jump right in. And I'm even going to start back in the beginning. They bring in the angels because there's a quote that I loved. If you want to help a man, you'll want to know something about him.
Yeah.
So we don't just jump into the story of why is everybody praying for George as the movie opens. We start into what's George's life like. And the theme, bang, 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 over and over, George saves someone else at a cost to himself.
Yeah.
He saves his brother from drowning. His brother gets saved from drowning. Pretty big win. But George gets sick and loses hearing in his ear. He loses hearing in he goes deaf in one of his ears. The next scene is he's working at Mr. Gower's. And he's like, Mr. Gower, I think you're trying to poison this lady. And Mr. Gower's slapping him around. Blood coming out of it. Don't hurt my sore ear. So he saves a life, but once again, at cost to himself because he gets slapped around. And he gets older, and now he's wanting to go to college and take a trip to Europe, and things happen. To save the building and loan, he gives up college. He gives up his trip to Europe. Meanwhile, Harry goes off and he's a superstar football player.
Right.
There's a run on the bank. He loses his honeymoon. He continues to save other people, but it's at a great cost to himself and what he wants. That
even happens when he meets Clarence. That's how Clarence saves him. Clarence saves him by jumping in so he'll save Clarence. Like, he's like, no, I jumped in to save you. Like, I didn't jump in to kill myself, because what did George want at that moment? What George wanted at that moment was to kill himself.
Right.
And so he had to give up again.
I don't get what I want because I got to save you, you klutzy angel.
And
by the way, I do have a little problem with Clarence. He was not in it for George. He was all about getting his own wings.
He was all about his wings. You know?
Like, you're not helping me get my wings, dude. I'm in a crisis here, and all you care about is your stupid wings. Come on, Clarence.
Well, I love that part of the movie where Clarence knows him, because you're right. At the beginning, it says, you want to help a man, you got to know him. You got to know a little bit about him. And what he sees time and time again is he will choose to help others. He will choose to do what's right and stand up for what's right.
Almost always at cost to himself.
Almost always at cost to himself. So if I want to stop him from killing himself, I have to give him something to save.
Yeah.
Because he thinks he's losing it all, but I have to give him something to save. And I love that moment, because it's so in character for everything. Even though the angel at the beginning says he's a little dim, right? He says he's dumb as a rabbit.
Talking about Clarence.
Talking about Clarence. He's dumb as a rabbit, but he has the faith of a child. Yeah. And then he says, is he sick? Because Clarence goes, what's wrong with him? Is he sick? He says, no, it's worse. He's discouraged.
Right.
It's like he was going to give up at the moment right before he was about to see everything come together. And people say this all the time. People say this all the time, and there's memes and there's all this stuff. And it's like, don't give up yet. Don't give up yet. It's right. You're right there. You're right at the edge. You're right at the cusp. You're going to want to give up, but don't do it yet, because you're on the right path. And we need people around us to help us see that. And again, that's one of the reasons why George was wealthy. So it wasn't just he was kind of down. It is that he was so discouraged he was going to give up his life, even though it was a lie, even though he was about to see the wealth that he really had.
That was such a good line that you had. He was about to give up at the moment before the miracle was about to happen. But what even more than that, because that feels very cliched and very, oh, that's nice to say. But he felt in that moment like he didn't matter. No one could rescue him. He had spent his whole life saving others, but who was there to save him? Nobody. And he felt completely alone. And that was really what happened was, yeah, the money was good, but what he saw was, I have friends, right? And that was Clarence's quote, no man is a failure who has friends.
That's right.
And they show up and they're because he's like, I can't go to these guys, because he was minimizing his own impact, but not an impact, but his relationship. Because even as he's going through all this movie, what do you see is him interacting with Ernie and what's the policeman's name?
Bert
and Ernie.
Bert and Ernie. I know.
The Muppet precursors.
Yep.
But you see him and everybody's like, oh, hey, George. And he knows everybody and they all know, like, and love George, even though he doesn't see it.
Yeah.
Which, coming from my background with my history and my dysfunction, I think seeing that message in this movie, what made it really resonate with me is, you know, I know what that's like, to feel like I'm constantly sacrificing what I want to help others.
Right.
But even more than that, like, it's one thing to feel like you're sacrificing to help them, but it's another to feel like, what does it matter?
Yeah, it didn't matter.
Right. What was it worth? Am I recognized? You know, when his friends go off to World War II, this guy was on Normandy. This guy stormed Austria. This guy, you know, they all did, you know, Harry shoots down the kamikazes that were going to kill the men in the transport. What does he do? Organize tire drives and
right.
Yeah. You know, he's going around in these thankless jobs. So he feels invisible. He feels unloved. He feels unappreciated. And those are things that I've struggled with for most of my life and maybe still do. My friends would probably say it still comes up every now and then. But I think that's why we love this movie, is because we can relate, especially as we get older. We see ourselves in George in that way. Yeah.
When we get older, it's very easy to say, oh man, I'm in my 40s. I'm in my 50s. I've wasted. What have I done?
Right.
I've wasted my life. I haven't done anything. I had all these dreams when I was young, you know, and that's why as a young person, you like the movie, but when you get older, you really love this movie because you can totally relate to that element of, what have I done? What have I done? What has been real about my life? Because as we see, like you said, time and time again, I kept writing down, life is interrupted. Life is interrupted. Life is interrupted. And all of his plans, everything is being interrupted by a crisis, a tragedy. So something's happening and he has to give up more and more and more. And so he comes to, what is this? What worth is this? What do I have?
What is it all for?
What is it all for? And I just want to say this right now, because part of what he's dealing with is, I've gotten nothing out of this. That's part of what he doesn't really say that, I don't think, in the movie, but part of that feeling is, what do I get out of this? You know, that's what I get for praying. He says when the dude hits him in the, he's begging God, weeping in the bar, and his friends are like, dude, what is wrong? And he's begging God to help him, and he gets punched because he, cussed out the dude on the phone. Lo and behold, he's there in the bar. And anyway, and he's like, that's what I get for praying. Like he thinks, man, all I get is hardship out of doing what's right. The Bible talks about this. David says, man, I look at the wicked and they're riding horses and they're doing all this stuff.
Why is my soul so troubled? And why are you downcast within me?
Right. And he says, and I look at the righteous and they're struggling in there and all this stuff. And he says, that's where I would have been until I went to the house of the Lord. And I realized their end, that the end is good. I want to kind of resist this idea that it's unchristian to think, how is this good for me? Because it sounds selfish, right? It sounds selfish for us to go
manipulative, yeah.
I'm doing what's good, I'm doing what's right, and all I get is hardship. And what's in it for me?
Yeah.
And there's literally a conversation where this happens in the Bible, where Peter or whoever it is, not Paul, Peter turns to Jesus and he's like, "We've given up everything. What about us? What do we get?" And Jesus doesn't say, "Well, that's selfish." What Jesus says is, oh, you're going to get a lot. He literally says, for anyone who's given up houses, lands, all this, children, whatever.
All the things.
All the things. if you've given up everything, you will receive in this life and in the life to come 100-fold, 30, whatever the numbers were, 30, 60, 100, or whatever they were. Like you will receive a harvest, not just in heaven. It's not just, well, when I get to heaven, like it's in this life too. And I didn't really understand it. And this is my way to understand it. I'm not saying this is I'm not John MacArthur. I'm not saying this is the only theological answer to this, but this is how God showed it to me. I went to Korea and I gave up a career. I gave up a lot, and it was joyous and I loved it. Wouldn't have traded it for anything.
Right.
But it was hard. I did give up a lot, and there was a lot of grief. That's a part of it, along with the joy. But while I'm there and I have friends, and I'm making friends in the trenches, and we went to Italy and Germany one summer, because of the military people that we knew in Korea. It was a hardship tour for them, and we were there with them, and and they were like, if you ever come to Europe, you can stay with us. And I'm like, don't say that, because
we will invite ourselves.
I hopped on a plane and moved to Korea. If you don't think I'll go to Europe, like, we're there, and my wife is a German major and she's fluent, and all that stuff. We spent a month in Germany and Italy and only had to spend one night in a hotel.
Wow.
And we chose to do that. We chose that because my wife is an introvert. She's like, can we just stay one place without people? We have taken long cross-country trips and never stayed a night in a hotel. If we take any trip and it's going to take more than 2 days, I'm like, well, who's in the middle that we know? My point is I have family all over the world. I have houses. You don't think that's wealth? You don't think that's wealth? Like that even becomes money. I go to somebody's house, they feed me. I get to stay with them. I don't use their toothbrush, but all that, not most
good
of the time.
To know you have a line somewhere.
And they welcome it because we're family.
Right.
And we're not blood family, but we live together. We struggled together. We went through an experience together. And that's how God showed me that in this life and in the life to come, you're going to be so wealthy. It's not for nothing. And it's not even that you didn't make a difference, although that's part of what George is dealing with, that he didn't make a difference, because he says it would be better for me if I'd never existed at all. Very Job moment, right? It's also, what did I get out of it? I gave up everything, and I'm like, I'm getting nothing. I'm going to go to jail.
Right.
Like,
Uncle Billy screwed up.
Because Uncle Billy screwed up. And all of that to say is I have that experience of realizing, man, I am so wealthy. It's not even about how much is in my bank account. Right. The fact that you have friends and you can say, I need a lawnmower. I need this. I need think about that sort of wealth. Like, relationships are wealth. You know what the problem is with most homeless men and women is they don't have relational capital. Right? When I lost my job and we couldn't pay our rent anymore, we could move in with my parents, right? Like we had relational capital in our lives of people who stepped up and were more than willing to help. A lot of times with someone who's homeless, most of the time, they don't have relational capital. Sometimes they burned a lot of that capital because they're addicts or something else. But all that to say is, that is a form of wealth that you cannot put a number on. You can't put a number on. And it's so important. So good.
And Britt is stepping all over where we're heading. So we're going to go back. We're going to play our first clip, which is probably a new record. We're over half an hour into this thing before we played our first clip. But this idea of what is wealth? Because George had it, but he didn't see it. I don't want to answer that really hard and fast yet, as Britt is we've discussed this concept, but there's a scene early in the movie where Harry's graduating high school and George and his dad are having dinner for what will end up being their last time. while George is out on his date with Mary, his dad will have a stroke and will die and will change his plans. But over dinner, they have a story because his father invites him to come to the building and loan.
Mm.
And for George, that is not a pleasant invitation.
I know it's soon to talk about it.
No, Pop. I couldn't. I couldn't face being cooped up for the rest of my life in a shabby little office. No, I'm sorry, Pop. I didn't mean that. It's this business of nickels and dimes and spending all your life trying to figure out how to save 3 cents in a length of pipe. I go crazy. I want to do something big and something important.
You know, George, I feel that in a small way we're doing something important. It's satisfying a fundamental urge. It's deep in the race for a man to want his own roof and walls and fireplace. And we're helping him get those things in our shabby little office.
I know, Pop. I know that. I wish I felt that I've been hoarding pennies like a miser here in order to... Most of my friends have already finished college. I just feel like if I didn't get away, I'd bust.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You're right, son.
You see what I mean, don't you, Pop?
This town is no place for any man unless he's willing to crawl to Potter. Now, you've got talent, son. I've seen it. You get yourself an education and get out of here.
Pop, you want a shock? I think you're a great guy.
Mm.
That whole scene, and it's interesting because you will see these conversations with his dad. You know, early on when he's a kid and he goes sees his father and Potter's talking down to him and he stands up. My father's the finest man in town.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks the world of his dad.
Right.
And him calling it is like, but very Varsity Blues. I don't want your life. Like that's what he tells him. But it's interesting as I was listening, he's like all this scratching for a nickel and trying to save 3 cents on a length of pipe and this and that. But he's been doing that very same thing as he's preparing for his own desires.
That's so good.
I've been living like a miser, trying to scrape together money to go to college and go to this, and I'm behind. And that's my question to a lot of you guys out there. Where do you feel like you're behind? All my friends are already finishing college. I haven't even started. All my friends have gone off to do this. I'm still stuck here, minding the fort, minding the kitchen, whatever the phrase is that you're stuck behind, right? All I'm doing is nothing. And all my friends are off doing great things. And I'm going to be stuck in this stuffy little office. I want to do something big and important. I want to build buildings. I want to see the world. But his father knew what was really important.
Mm-hmm.
And it was about giving dignity and respect to the people in his community. Because he's like, you need to get out of here because the only reason you should stay here is if you want to crawl and beg to Potter. Because Potter's got this city in a vice grip. And that's what we see. If George wasn't around, it becomes Pottersville and everything's Potter. And it's a life of escape. It's all drinking and girls because they want to escape the slums that Potter's forced him because the rent's so high and it's a crappy little thing. But you give man dignity of a roof over his head, then what that does is that creates a better person. And George sees it even though he doesn't want it.
It's such an important scene because you see two things, just like you saw when he was a little boy, his respect for his father and what his father was doing, what his father was about, and how his father called him to it. His father did call him to it, but gave him the choice.
Right.
See, God does the same thing. God will call you to a purpose, but he will not force you to a purpose necessarily. Although, George is forced into his purpose. He's given choices along the way.
He's got choices, But it would be false for him to do other, like when like I said, his dad is about to die.
Right.
He loses his trip to Europe. He's late for college, but he is faced with a choice. The building and loan can continue if you stay on as the executive officer.
That's right.
You can stay here and continue your father's work, or you can go to college and fulfill your own dreams.
Right.
And for George, it's no choice really because of who he is.
He doesn't feel like it's a choice. He feels like he's stuck with it. He keeps feeling like he's stuck with this life where you're right. He's given choices with the honeymoon because he keeps being told, just go. Just his father tells him, that's what you want. Go do it. See, God knows what we really want. God knows who we are. God knows what's going to satisfy us.
Well, hang on. I want to sit on that for a second. Think how important that permission is. Oh, you want to go away? You can. Okay, Pop. Knowing, because his pop trusts who he is becoming, who George is. Knowing that if something happens, he might say this in the moment. I got to go do something big. I can't be stuck in a stuffy office. But knowing that he would, but if he said, no, I need you to do this, if his father asked him to give it up, it's one thing. But when he chooses to give it up in service to others, in service to God, or, for our spiritual purposes, it's a much different thing than feeling forced and coerced and manipulated into that. So that permission, that idea of permission is, I think, a very key piece that a lot of guys don't really grasp hold of.
And it's something I talk about with my kids. I mean, my kids feel stuck. I feel stuck. My wife feels stuck. And we have these conversations all the time about have to. When you live according to have to, it'll eat you alive. Yep. The have to's never end. The have to's never stop. Yep. And so unless you decide that you are free, like with Free Guy, right? Like the have to's never end. And so until you decide like, no, I'm not going to be bound by have to's. And that takes a relationship with God to set you free. There's a lot of elements to that.
Yeah, my kids would always say, do I have to read?
Yeah, right. No. You get to read.
You get to read.
There's a great Steve Harvey little video I think maybe we've talked about before where he says you got to change your vocabulary. Instead of I have to go to work, I get to go to work. I get to do this for my kids. I get to do these things. You change your mindset. And that was difficult for George because like a lot of us, we see these big dreams we had kind of fly out the window and we think my life's a waste, and you're comparing it. He's always being compared to Sam Wainwright. He's always being compared to Harry. He's always being compared to everybody else. And like, he doesn't have anything. And it's so easy for us to do it
by himself. He's the one doing it. No one outside his family is doing that, or no one outside his own head, I think, is really saying you should have been, you could have been. It's all in, I'm not enough. I'm behind those guys. Nobody's comparing him except him.
And sometimes Potter, and sometimes there's certain people who do the enemy, right? And but what's so important about this movie as we're going forward, because I think the father's call is a huge part of what we're talking about. The father calls but gives permission, because as I keep saying, the kingdom of God is not about coercion. It is about relationship. But it's also about love, and it cannot be a kingdom of love if you have been manipulated and coerced into it or forced. That's abuse. Now, that doesn't mean that God doesn't want you. It doesn't mean that God won't organize things to give you the choice again and again and again and again and try to make it as clear, and he will plead with you. But at some point, he will let you make those choices. But his call is to what is going to satisfy your heart. That's who George was. Like you said, like we said before, they keep calling him. They keep showing that this is who George is. He's going to save people. Given the opportunity, he's going to save people. and he will fight against tyranny, and he will fight against oppression, and he will fight against all these things that he knows are wrong, even though there's a part of him that wants this huge adventure. But what's really important is the romantic element of Mary. This movie doesn't happen without her, because there's some of the most romantic scenes when he's walking her home and she's got the robe and he's got that scene is one of the most romantic.
It's a very interesting dilemma.
It's a very interesting situation. Not many, not different balls, at least. And the scene where Sam Wainwright calls her and his mom doesn't force him.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
But she's like, why
and
don't
they're
you?
sitting there listening on the little phone and
that anger in him, that's like, oh my God, I love her, but I don't want to. Like, just that moment is so well done. And that passion is such a passion. It's a very passionate movie when you really think about it. And the moment where he comes home and he's discouraged and she's like, she tells him she's pregnant, and it's so and
the wedding night.
Oh, the wedding night is so romantic. It's so, but again, and you pointed out before we started, and it was it's a great point, is when he's trying to avoid going to Mary's house, he comes across Violet, who he's kind of flirted with, right? And she's pretty and she's hot and all this stuff. And he's like, let's go let's go on an adventure. And she's like, I can't.
Let's go be barefoot in the meadows and climb Bedford Falls Mountain.
Let's go swimming in the falls.
She's like, you're crazy, George Bailey.
Like, she was ready to go. She's ready to go do something with him. It wasn't clear what, but not that. And so he gets even more frustrated because he's like, that's not what I want. And Mary is the adventure. Mary is part of the adventure. He finds a person who is willing to be creative. Like I said in the beginning, she's willing to, just like my wife, willing to make a home where there's not one.
She's a dreamer.
Yeah. But she's a realist enough to go like, okay, well, she's a problem solver. Like, she is an amazing character, and
she sees the truth.
Yeah.
She sees the truth in George, and she sees the truth in the house. She sees what both of them can be.
Yes.
And is there to help bring that to life.
Right. And so, just like Adam and Eve, George was given somebody to help him fulfill his purpose as a partner in the purpose. So much so that he comes home and the bank examiners, like, who does this nowadays? Who leaves their kids at home with bank examiners ready to, like, these kids are just, mom just left. But she's going out to look for him. She's calling people. Will you pray? Isn't that amazing? Yeah. Like, I know he's having a hard time now. She's going to protect her kids, right? Like George, that's, and
you're scaring the children.
And he apologizes and all that sort of stuff. But she's like, yes, pray for your dad. And she calls people.
But in a sense, his isolation was self-imposed.
Yes.
He wasn't telling her what the problem was. He was just like, everything's fine.
Yeah.
Same old. Yeah. He wasn't.
Yes.
She's like, look, if you're going to close me out, you need to find somewhere else to be.
Yeah.
As soon as you want to include me, you're welcome home.
Right.
But then he leaves and she's like, all right, what's going on? What can I do? How can I help him? How can I help him through this crisis?
Yeah.
Even as he's pushing me away.
Right. And she is integral to him fulfilling his father's purpose. Don't you want to, I'd love to give you the building and loan. No, Dad, man, I can never do that. And I've told this story before, but it's like James Nevins when I was in Korea and he's a 16-year-old kid and he's a point guard of the basketball team and we're going somewhere and he looks at me and he says, Mr. Mooney, I can never do what you do. And I said, James, do you think I thought I was going to be doing this when I was 16 years old? Like, do you think this is what I thought I was going to be doing? Like, I thought I was going to be a rock star. I was growing my hair long. I was writing songs. Like, no, this is what God has for me. I was told by a prophet pastor guy that I got to know at one point. We were having this conversation, and he didn't even know me. And he looked at me, and we're talking about Jesus. And I was maybe 20, 21. And he looks at me and he goes, "You're a pastor." I said, "No, I'm not." Like, right? What am I doing now? I'm a church planting pastor. I looked at a guy who was my math teacher as a senior in high school, and he'd give me a hard time about my homework. He didn't like me because I was a Christian, and I would fight him, not physically, right? But I'd go right back at him, right? And this is just to show you who I was at 18. I looked at him in the face and I said, "I will never do your job." Now, guess where God led me?
Did you become a teacher?
I became a teacher. Here's my point. I've been there where God's like, I was drugged into church planting. I'm like, okay, fine, I'll minister. But man, I don't plant a church. Like that's hard, like I've seen people struggle with that. Like, just have me be in front of people and talk. Like, I can do that. And not that he doesn't want me to do that, but the point is like, there's been so many cases where God's led me kicking and screaming into things. But at the same time, there was a moment in my early 20s when I was opening at Subway. That was my job. I was in college and I was opening at Subway. And I took those moments to just sing a cappella. I didn't have like headphones in or anything. And I would praise God. I would just sing because I was alone and opening and getting everything set up. And there was one morning where God took me to a different place. This doesn't happen a lot in life, maybe to some people, but it happened to me. I was literally in a different place, and I had a vision, and God showed me hills and it was like grasslands and hills and a path that led up to the top of a hill, and there was a door. And he said, "I want you to go through the door." And I said, I couldn't see what was on the other side. And I said, "What's on the other side?" He goes, "I'm not going to tell you. I want you to go through the door." And I said, "But I don't know. What's on the other side?" And he said, "Just do it." And my only question was, "Will you be with me when I go?" And he said, "Yes." And that was a moment in my life. And so as I'm sitting there with that James Nevins kid, and he's a little punk and he's point guard and he doesn't think he knows what he's doing with his life. And I'm like, dude, you think I knew this was going to happen? Like, I would have never told you. Like, this would have been so far from what I thought I was going to do at 16, was be a teacher. Like I said, when I told the teacher,
who would become a pastor,
a teacher in another country, but not like in Europe or something, like in Korea somewhere where I'm too tall and I don't like the food. Like, this isn't me. Like, I didn't do this. Like, this wasn't my plan. And yet, like I'm telling you, it has made me the richest man I know. And I literally wrote a song when I lost my job. I was fired. Well, let go. I was let go from a job. And it was during the recession in 2008, 2009. And it was hard. And we had a baby on the way. Hosanna was about to be born. I ended up writing a song called "I'm the Richest Man I Know," because God kept showing me what wealth really is and what do you really have. I'm just saying I've been there. And so, yeah, that's why I get all teary eyed when I watch this movie too, because I've been there. When you've lived that sort of life, but at the end, when you realize what you get out of the Father's purpose, it's so amazing.
I think it's very easy. Many pastors, preachers, speakers, whatever word you want to use to describe the people who speak to you, they'll paint the Christian life as a walk down the yellow brick road. It's like, oh, it's all glorious. Doors are opening left and right. It's clear. It's sunny. It's easy. And throughout this movie, George Bailey is fulfilling his father's purpose. But it's hard. It's hard. And it hurts.
Yeah.
And it feels terrifying. It feels worthless. You feel unseen, unrecognized, unappreciated. And that's what George feels in this whole movie. He does have this wealth. He does have these riches. He is making a difference. It may not be, he wanted to build big buildings, but he doesn't. He wanted to go see the world and he's not. But what he is doing, remember, going back to that conversation with his father, what is the purpose? But we are doing something big. We are doing something important.
Yep.
We think that when we're doing God's will and God's purpose, it like the sea parts and it's easy to walk across. But it's hard and it's painful and there's questions and doubts. And like you said, Father, I don't know what this is going to be, but you're going to be with me, right? When my business fails, when I get fired, when my kids turn away from the faith, when my wife dies, when I'm going through stuff I would never wish on anyone, you're still there, right?
Yeah. It's a question I was asked. He didn't ask me, but I was talking with a friend, talking about another friend of mine who, quote unquote, came out to me as an atheist, right? Someone I had discipled and led and just lived life with. And this person, and I had this big, long conversation with this person who had been kind of avoiding me, but he came out to me when I finally said, man, what's going on with you? Let's have lunch. Let's, and he explained how he was now an atheist and all this sort of stuff. And part of the root of it was a hard time that he went through where he prayed to God and God didn't answer according to his expectation. And that was a big part of the story, his story about how he became an atheist. And he's still an atheist. But I was talking with a different friend of mine and just wrestling with like, man, of course, I spoke truth to him and love and just called him back to truth. But of course, he's had made his decision. But I was talking with another friend later about it. And this guy said, hey, man, hard times are going to come. I don't care who you are. The Bible never, in fact, if anything, the Bible, like we've said, promises hard times. But the question is, would you rather go through them with God or through them without God? Like, which one would you rather? And he said, my choice has always been, I'd rather go through those hard times with God. And you see a lot of that in this story where, again, he doesn't get it yet. And even though, here's one thing I love about it is, and we kind of touched on it, but just to kind of reiterate that his decisions were always to protect his father's legacy. So yes, it was two things. And I think this is very instructive. It was number one, to protect people from oppression, but it was also to protect his father's legacy and his father's purpose. He would not let that go. When Harry wasn't going to take it on, fine, I'll take it on. Like, he loved his father. And so it was to take on the purpose, and it was to protect people. Because a lot of times sacrifice isn't apart from love, right? God's not a masochist. He's not asking us to sacrifice because he wants us to have pain. The sacrifice is so that others can live. For God so loved the world that he gave. Like, he didn't give his son to die just because he wants his son to die. He led his son to a sacrifice, and the son chose it, right? Going back to the permission is important, right? Jesus said, no man takes my life from me, I give it. George willingly, maybe kicking and screaming at times, gave of himself. So that but it wasn't just because sacrifice is cool, right? Obedience is greater than sacrifice, right? It's for love. It's because he loved this town. He loved the people. He loved the purpose. He saw it. And that is so important, because I think so often we call people to give money. We call people to stuff, but the core that we should call people to is love. The other stuff will come. And it seems like a really mean thing to ask. But the question is, but do you love them? But do you love them? Do you love people? Because that's really the question. The question isn't, do you have money or are you willing to give? The question is, do you love people? Because when that's true, the resources, the actions will flow from that.
And so we are landing this plane. And I want to go back to that big question. What is wealth? And we've hinted around it. I think there's been a lot of pictures of it. And going back to the concept of treasures. Mm. Wealth and treasure, that's pretty synonymous, right? Yeah. Don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal. You can't keep that. Earthly treasure you can't keep.
Right.
But lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. And then he says, where your heart is.
Right.
Where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. That's where you will find your treasure. And Britt, you and I, you commented on it before we started recording, and I had noticed the same thing when they were going through the run on the bank. And Potter's there offering him a way out. And he sees the picture of his father, and underneath is a plaque that neither one of us had noticed before. And on it was said, all you can take with you is that which you have given away. Mm. What is wealth? Wealth is the accumulation of things that money cannot buy. Wealth is relation, as you mentioned, relational. Like I said, we've talked about it. We've built up to this. We've built up to this. What is wealth? It's fulfilling the Father's purpose. It's all you can take with you is that which you've given away. What is wealth, and what has God done but sent us his son? Oh, here we are on Christmas. Advent is a season of waiting for the promise to arrive. And now we celebrate a wealth that can never be taken away. We celebrate a life and a freedom that we have. We have permission to become who God created us to be. Mm. And we love this movie because we have a wealth that can never be taken away. We have a freedom and a life that isn't governed by how much we make or how big our car is or how nice our house is. It's governed by the peace and the wholeness of our heart. And that's only possible through the birth of Christ. Mm. And that's a treasure. You and I know this. That's a treasure because we've lived life on the other side. We've experienced life on our own, in our own efforts, striving and chasing. And I want to do big things, and I want to be awesome, and I want to do it my way, to channel Frank Sinatra. But we know that that's not freedom. That's just another kind of slavery, because we're constantly building stuff that can be taken away.
Right.
What do I have that can't be taken away? And that's where your wealth is. That's where your treasure is. Yeah. And it starts with the Father's purpose.
You know, Jesus said, if you seek to save your life, you will lose it. That's what those interruptions were trying to keep George from doing, saving his own life. But this is what Jesus says: if you lose your life for my sake, and one of the iterations of that in one of the Gospels says, and the sake of the gospel, you will find it. And that's what George does. George is such an important moment, and I had never seen it before. When he looks at his father, and he's in the middle of a crisis, and that's what we have to do. In the middle of a crisis, we have to take that moment and look at our father and see what he's saying. And right underneath the picture of the father was that moment of all you can take with you is that which you've given away. If you seek to save your life, you lose it. What about us? Peter says, what about me? We've given everything to follow you. It was almost like an accusation. What about us? We didn't have anything to begin with, and what we had, we gave it to you.
We never left. Everybody else left. We're still here.
Right? Oh no, you're going to get a lot. Oh, you're going to get a lot. You're going to get more than you ever imagined. 50, 100, whatever. Like, it's going to be so big. It's infinite. So you can only keep things when you make them eternal. Like I think I said in one of the previous episodes that we recorded, but that's how you can keep things. More temporary things are just it's just all going to go away. right? That's why if you seek to save your life, you're going to lose it. But if you take your life and lose it for the eternal, you get to keep that and everything else. It's just, right. It lasts forever. And that's part of the gift of the gospel, is that it matters, even when we don't think it matters, even when the person that we loved walks away anyway, even when the person that we tried to reach out to, they reject us, or they betray us, or our plans fail, or whatever happens, that even when that happens, God says it didn't mean nothing. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. We see kind of a very physical explanation of that, right? It's very clear, right? That what George thought he needed was money, but what he had, the wealth he had, was friends, like we keep saying. And with the friends came wealth, right? Like that was what we saw at the end. Like with the friends came what he needed, and abundantly more, right?
And I think what you were saying was the purpose is worth the pain. Mm. And that's what happens. There's that cemetery scene where he shows up and he's like, wow, this should be Bailey Park. There should be houses built, right, where people are living in them. His brother, no, my brother saved the men on the transport. Those men on the transport died because you weren't there to save Harry. You've had a wonderful life, George. Mm. That's what Clarence tells him. Because in that moment, basically he lost his life and he saw how his life had impacted the lives of those around him. That is a wonderful gift. Yeah. Because you do get to see the difference that you make, and we will see that. We will see that in clarity one day. But it's when he realizes that, and he goes back to the bridge and he says, I want to live again. Mm. Give me back my life. Not for him, right? He's like, if I don't live, Mary doesn't live. She's alone. My kids don't live. Violet is here, Ernie and Bert, and they're miserable. Uncle Billy's in the insane asylum. Right. His mother's miserable. He sees the impact of a life that we don't get to see on this side of heaven. Right. We trust Romans 8:28. God, I don't know it. Your ways are higher than my ways. I'm trusting you. Trusting you that it's going to work out, because I don't see it. I trust that you see me and that I'm working towards your purposes. I wonder if when Peter said that of, Lord, we've left everything and we're here. If Jesus didn't look at Peter sort of the way Harry looks at George here in the very last scene.
Blizzard. Oh, Harry, how about your banquet in New York?
Oh, I left right in the middle of it. As soon as I got Mary's telegram. Good idea, Ernie. A toast. To my big brother, George, the richest man in town.
And he's like, you are the richest man in town because you know me, basically. Yeah. It's like, you can't ask for anything more than I can. It's like all this stuff, you're not going to be happy with it. You're not going to be satisfied. Building buildings and going on adventures and making more money and nicer cars and a nicer house, that's not going to satisfy you. But what is? It's like, what I have to give you, no one can take away. And if you have that, then you do have a wonderful life. Mm.
We have to realize that there are a lot of people out there around the holidays who are really struggling, and they are very discouraged and maybe even suicidal. And they're not going to share that on Facebook, and they're not going to put that out right. on Instagram, and they're not going to put it on TikTok or Pinterest. Or they're not going to call people and tell them. You're going to have to be involved in their lives. and invite them, because what happens in those moments of crisis is what George does. Is he goes off and isolates himself. That's part of the lie, is he goes off and he isolates himself. And so just to encourage people, because it is so easy to be busy and to be ruled by the tyranny of the moment, to choose to check up on people. People are struggling, and it's going to take people checking in on people and just checking and seeing, how you doing? How can I help? Can we get together? Can we have lunch? And just reach out to some people? You don't have to be everybody. God will tell you who, but it's an important thing to do around Christmas. And it's something that I have learned to do more of as I've gotten older, is expect that people are struggling around the hell. I actually expect it more. I used to expect that everybody was happy. Oh, it's Christmas. Everybody's happy, right?
Yeah.
But some people may have crazy eyes that we don't see, right? They may be really dealing with things in a very dark way, and they need a community to show up and say, "Hey, we love you," because that shows people that another world exists. There's something else that's real.
Because if you want to help a man, you'll want to know something about him. And you might earn your wings that way, right? We'll ring a bell for you here on the podcast. So this has been Paul McDonald and Britt Mooney talking about It's a Wonderful Life. And we hope, we wish for you a wonderful Christmas season heading into a new year. May it be warm and bright. And we hope to see you next time here on the Men at the Movies podcast.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?